On this edition of the Geopolitics and Empire podcast, we discuss America's attempts to repeatedly overthrow Iran and potentially draw us toward the brink of World War III. I'd like to remind listeners to subscribe to all of our mainstream and alternative social media, including YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, SoundCloud, and to leave us a review and rating on iTunes. Subscribe to the weekly newsletter, The Geopolitical Intelligencer, which you can find on geopoliticsandempire.com. And please leave us a $1 or $2 tip via Patreon, PayPal, or Bitcoin. I hope you enjoy the show and send us your comments and feedback. We are speaking with human rights lawyer and author Dan Kovalik about his latest book, The Plot to Overthrow Iran: How the CIA and Deep State Have Conspired to Vilify Iran. He is also the author of The Plot to Scapegoat Russia and the upcoming The Plot to Control the World. Dan, your books seem to be doing very well, given there are numerous publications on U.S.-Iranian relations, which include everything from the declassified documents hosted on the National Security Archive to Stephen Kinzer's All the Shah's Men. What motivated you to write on the subject of U.S. intervention in Iran?
Well, I was very inspired by my trip to Iran, which I took in the summer of 2017. I was invited to speak at the University of Tehran, and I took that opportunity, and I was really impressed with the country, with the people, who are famously hospitable, and they certainly lived up to that reputation. And the country is just so beautiful and full of these ancient, artifacts and antiquities and churches and mosques. And when I was there, it made me think that the reason these things were still there is because it was one of the few countries in the Middle East that hadn't been invaded by the U.S. yet, and I really felt the need to do something, to write something opposing U.S., military threats against Iran.
And how do you view the United States? I've interviewed Johann Galtung, and I like his quote where he says, "I love the U.S. Republic, but I hate the U.S. Empire," and I sort of feel the same way. I grew up in the U.S. like most children, admiring the founding principles of the U.S., but later realizing it's really an empire. And so, what's your view there?
Yeah, well, just a little background on myself. I mean, I was raised in a very conservative household in the U.S., in Ohio, to Roman Catholic parents. And I was very patriotic and really believed in America and what it stood for. And over the years, after traveling around to Central America, South America, to places like Iran, I've taken a much dimmer view of the United States. I guess I would agree that I support the American Republic, though I don't know how much of the Republic is left. There was a quote from the Democratic Party platform from 1906, I think it was, where they say, a country cannot exist half empire, half republic. And right now, I'd say we're like, 75% empire, 25% republic. I think the empire has swollen, or has swallowed, I should say, the republic. And I think Americans have not caught on to that fact, and in fact are in great denial about that truth. I think we're the only empire that's ever existed on Earth that hasn't called itself an empire, right? I mean, most empires proudly say we're an empire, right? We're the British Empire, the Roman Empire, the Greek Empire, the U.S., which is a greater empire than any that have ever existed, ever. The Roman Empire had like 33 military bases around, a very small space, in truth. A small region. The British Empire had 36 military bases. The U.S. has 1,000 military bases in the world in 138 countries. There's never been a bigger empire, and yet the American people will not recognize it as such. And I think that is, once if you can't even name the problem, if you can't even diagnose the problem, how can you cure it, right? So I have a very dim view of the United States. You know, Trump's campaign slogan was "Make America Great Again," and my view is America's never been great. I mean, my reading of history is that's never been great.
And I think that's one of the biggest hindrances, as you say, that we don't call it a republic. Um, and Stephen Kinzer in his latest book says the empire began somewhere in 1898 with the Spanish-American War, and somewhere after World War II. We also interviewed Jefferson Morley, who wrote his latest book about James Angleton, the CIA head, and calling him one of the founding fathers of this notion of the deep state after World War II. So we have the American Empire, some around the turn of that century. And in your title, you mentioned the deep state. If you could also just give us your definition or view of this deep state.
Yeah, so I think the deep state, however you categorize it, is this bureaucracy that exists regardless of who is the elected official, right? So you may elect a new president who may even want peace, may want better human rights, right? And the problem that president will confront is the fact that the folks in the CIA and the Defense Department and in the four military branches and in the Department of Homeland Security and in the immigration department, all these bureaucratic institutions have lifetime bureaucrats who have their own view of where they want to go and what they want to do, and I think it really prevents a true democratic functioning. And I think Eisenhower started to put his finger on this, in his last presidential address when he talked about the military-industrial complex. He was talking about an institution which the democratic levers could not control. And I think that institution is greater and worse now than it was in the 50s.
Okay, and getting now back more into Iran again. I taught a course on U.S. foreign policy at one of Mexico's top universities some years ago, the Tecnológico de Monterrey, and I enjoyed reading with students the declassified CIA papers on Operation Ajax from 1953, the 1953 overthrow of Iran. We also read the World Court verdict from 1952, where Mossadegh, who was an international lawyer, successfully defended himself. He won the case against Britain at the behest of British Petroleum on the nationalization of Iranian oil. And as you describe in your book, the 1953 overthrow by the USA was the CIA's first overthrow of a foreign government. And we have this climate today where the USA, Israel, Saudi Arabia desperately wish to overthrow the current Iranian theocracy, yet in 1952, the USA was not happy either with an Iranian democracy. So it's quite amusing how the US is neither content with a theocratic nor democratic Iran. So what is it? What's the problem? What is it the USA wants? What is their geopolitical endgame?
Well, I think that is, of course, the $64,000 question. I mean, first of all, we have to recognize the fact that the U.S. is not interested in promoting democracy per se in the world. The U.S. It currently supports 73% of the world's dictatorships, right? So we have to get that out of our heads, that democracy is relevant to the U.S. at all in terms of international affairs. I mean, certainly it'll support a democracy if that advances, its geopolitical and economic interests, but it's agnostic about that. So, in the case of Mossadegh, they didn't like him, even though he was Democratic, because he did nationalize British Petroleum, what became British Petroleum. It wasn't known as that at that time. And because they couldn't settle on how much money he was to pay in compensation for that. But even beyond that, it was more important. I mean, Mossadegh, by doing the nationalization, proved himself to be an unreliable partner in the world. It didn't matter how much he was going to pay for the concession. In fact, at one point, Mossadegh, believing in the Americans, having this kind of naive faith in the United States over Britain, who they knew were screwing them over, right, offered for President Eisenhower to decide on his own what concession he was going to pay to the British for the nationalization of the oil industry. But even that wasn't good enough because, again, he proved himself to be too nationalistic. And the U.S., wanted someone more compliant in Iran. And in the end, the U.S. decided, hey, we could muscle in and get our own concession, right? We're not going to fight for the British concession of the Iranian oil industry. We want our share. And in the end, the U.S. got the lion's share of the Iranian oil industry. So that explains why we did what we did then. And so then, of course, we supported the Shah. We installed the Shah, who was a king, and he was not popular. And so the CIA helped create this brutal security institution known as the Savak, and they taught the Savak Nazi torture techniques, and they worked with the Savak and to the bitter end to rule Iran. And by 1978, Amnesty International concluded that Iran had the very worst human rights record on earth, which is something. And the U.S. backed it, into the bitter end, which came in February 1979 when the Shah and his Savak were finally overthrown. So then after that happened, then what does the U.S. want? Well, first of all, in the final days of the Shah, Jimmy Carter, and I talk about this in the book, maneuvered to make sure that the Ayatollah Khomeini became the leader of Iran. He knew the Shah was going down. He was not popular. There were mass demonstrations. He was going to be overthrown. He had also been diagnosed with terminal cancer, so he was done. And at that point, the U.S. decided they would rather a fundamentalist leader like Khomeini in lieu of, some sort of left-wing government, which could have been a possibility at the time. And so Carter, in the final hours, made sure it was Khomeini who came back from Paris and was put into power in Iran. So the leftists would not take power. In 1983, Reagan and in the UK and Israel, all three actually shared information with Khomeini on leftists and communists and socialists living in Iran. And he used that information to wipe out, the last vestiges of the left in Iran. So the point being, the U.S. will always pick a fundamentalist over a progressive leftist socialist leader anytime, and that's what happened, with Iran. But even that's not good enough, right? And so the problem still remains that the current government of Iran is still not compliant enough for the U.S. It has at least some sort of general anti-imperialist, philosophy, and it certainly has no inkling to be a pawn of the U.S. or of Israel or to advance either one of their interests. Iran is openly in favor of, more Palestinian sovereignty. And it's, obviously very dedicated to having national control of its industry, as Mossadegh did as well. So that's not, acceptable to the U.S. So the question is then, what would be acceptable? I mean, I think either some other, leadership like the Shah, who would be a lackey of the U.S., and the U.S. has, in fact, promoted the son of the Shah, who lives in Paris, as a possible leader. So that's one possibility. The other, frankly, would be the Libya model, which would be no government at all. It'd be some sort of, chaos and anarchy in which, Iran would at least not present any opposition to the U.S. It wouldn't be able to protect its people or its oil industry against exploitation. So that would be, frankly, like the worst case scenario for Iran would be the Libya type situation, where you would have just a state of anarchy. And really, in that situation, people would not thrive.
And you've mentioned, well, I also wanted to mention, that's pretty outrageous that they, in recent years, seriously advocated the Shah's son coming back. I mean, that's kind of comical. And you mentioned the Savak. I just wanted to say that that's one of the areas in your book that gave a little bit more insight for me, with a little bit of new information, because you go into detail about the Savak, and it's quite. I mean, the details are quite horrific there. And you mentioned the naivety of Mossadegh and his restraint against Washington. If you could just comment on this kind of trend or pattern with these world leaders who have been naive, Mossadegh, Gaddafi in some ways, Saddam Hussein, and
Ho Chi Minh a little bit, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And sometimes, I don't know, some people say that Putin and Russia can tend to be naive, and you've wrote a book about Russia and Putin. And are we seeing something that world leaders like Putin don't see, or do they see something we don't see? It seems that most of these targeted leaders are afraid to act against the Washington, Brussels, Saudi, Tel Aviv nexus.
Well, look, I certainly think there is a large amount of fear amongst any country who would go against, those countries you mentioned, only because they are much militarily more powerful than any other bloc in the world. But it's not just fear. I mean, it is ideological. I think the U.S. has done an amazing job in promoting this idea, not just amongst its own people, but amongst peoples throughout the world, that somehow it is this unique beacon for democracy and freedom in the world. And I think that people like Mossadegh, like Ho Chi Minh, like Putin at times, they did, and Gaddafi in his final years, they were wooed by this idea. It's an incredibly powerful ideology. And I quote Harold Pinter a lot in my books. He was a British writer, and he won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 2005. And he gave this speech. Incredibly, it was not a literary speech so much as a political speech. And he talked about the almost magical power the U.S. has to convince the world of its inherent goodness, even when it is supporting a fascist coup in Chile or in Argentina or in Greece. You go down the line. And I think it is a powerful cultural and ideological force. The interesting thing about President Trump is that he may be the catalyst for starting to break through that ideological, magic trick, because he is now the true ugly face of U.S. imperialism. He represents, in a way that no president has for a long time, the true nature of the U.S. Republic, such as it is, racist, xenophobic, irrational, militaristic. And I think the world is seeing this. And it's like the mask has been ripped off. And there's some good to that. I think that mask has to be ripped off. And a lot of us, like myself, we write books and articles to try to expose the true nature of U.S. empire. And I think finally the world is seeing its true nature, and it's not very pretty.
And one of the topics of your book, you also write about the U.S. support for terrorism, which kind of boggles my mind. I've had students, U.S. American students, even in Mexico, who got really offended when I, in my courses, described U.S. support for terrorism. And I've even had their parents write letters and emails to my superiors complaining about it. And you write about the U.S. supporting the Iranian MEK terrorist organization. We know the U.S. has created Al-Qaeda. They're openly supporting ISIS. Tulsi Gabbard recently spoke about this in Congress. We've had the former Afghan President Karzai speak to this. The DIA former director Michael Flynn has revealed this. Vladimir Putin has, between the lines, spoken about this at the UN. We've interviewed MI6 spy Annie Machon, who was a whistleblower about this, and the list goes on. And in fact, the recent military parade in Iran, there was a terrorist attack, I guess some days ago or a week ago. 30-some Iranians were killed in the terror attack, and Iran says that it was a terrorist organization supported by foreign powers, including the U.S. and Saudi Arabia, who were culpable of that. I'm dumbfounded at how the U.S. continues to openly get away with arming, funding, and training ISIS and other terrorists in front of the whole world, and yet everybody pretends like it's not happening. How is this possible, and how can we help stop this?
Yes, well, again, you point out this amazing feat that the U.S. has pulled off. It, especially after 9/11, of course, it said, hey, we're going to fight this war on terror, right? In the end, it fought a war of terror. It knocked off states that opposed Al-Qaeda, like Hussein's Iraq, like Gaddafi's Libya, like Assad's Syria. They weren't successful there, but they tried. They'd like to knock off Iran. All those countries under those leaders I just mentioned were mortal enemies of Al-Qaeda. And yet it was those countries the U.S. targeted after 9/11, not Saudi Arabia, despite the fact that 15 of the 19 terrorists who, flew planes into the World Trade Centers were Saudis, despite the fact that bin Laden himself was a Saudi, despite the fact that, as the 9/11 Commission concluded, Saudi Arabia played a role in helping organize the 9/11 attacks. Instead, the U.S. has partnered with Saudi Arabia against the other countries opposed to Al-Qaeda and like terrorist groups. And again, anyone who's honest will point this out. And at times, surprisingly, people have. Vice President Joe Biden at one point admitted this. Hillary Clinton admitted this at one point. Donald Trump, during his campaign for president, would allude to these facts. It's not a secret. And yet people are not willing to embrace these facts and grapple with the implications of them. We just commemorated another 9/11 anniversary recently. And on that date, September 11, 2018, a number of papers, including the LA Times, ran stories saying Al-Qaeda is now more powerful today than it was at 9/11/2001 when the attacks happened. I mean, it's an incredible statement. Minimally, what that means is that the $6 trillion or so the U.S. has spent after 9/11 allegedly to fight terror has been utterly futile and wasteful. That's the best you could say about it. The worst you could say is those $6 trillion were spent actually propping up terrorism throughout the world. And I believe the latter is true, and it's undeniably true. And if you're an American citizen and you grapple with this fact that we had this horrible terrorist attack on 9/11/2001, and that your hard-earned dollars then went to actually support the countries that were behind the 9/11 attacks in order to fight other countries who opposed Al-Qaeda in the 9/11 attacks, including Iran, by the way, who helped the U.S. after 9/11 to fight Al-Qaeda, to fight the Taliban in Afghanistan. If you were to come to that conclusion, and it's the only one conclusion you could come to if you were honest about the world, you would have to believe the truth, and that is that American foreign policy does not exist to promote national security, meaning security of people like you and I, right, who are citizens of the U.S. Instead, it has another purpose. I would say that purpose is, of course, to promote economic penetration of the world, to benefit a very few, very wealthy people and interests in the U.S. But however you come to conclude what it is about, you have to conclude without question what it's not about. And it's not about protecting the homeland. It has nothing to do with that. In fact, the world is much less safe now than it was on 9/11, and that's after trillions of dollars the U.S. has spent allegedly fighting the war on terror. I mean, it's an amazing fact. And again, it would make George Orwell blush, truthfully.
So let's fast forward a bit. In your book, you mention the 2006 Israeli war against Lebanon as an opening salvo against Iran. You also discuss the proxy war against Yemen, which is also targeting Iran and Syria as well. We've interviewed former diplomat Jim Jatras, who discussed how Syria is really about Iran. So if we could talk just about the last decade or two of U.S. interference in Iran, we know the U.S. uses a sophisticated network of NGOs to nonviolently overthrow foreign governments through these so-called color revolutions, where they actually pick the colors. And I believe they failed miserably to overthrow Iran in 2009 with a green revolution. Could you speak to these recent attempts?
Yes, well, we know from General Wesley Clark, an American general who actually was the supreme commander of NATO for a while. He discovered and revealed that there was a plan hatched shortly after 9/11 to overthrow, I believe it was 7 different countries in the Middle East and Northern Africa, beginning with Iraq and ending with Iran. Iran was to be the jewel in the crown. And the penultimate country was Syria. They knew that the road to Iran was through Syria. They would have to topple Assad in order to go after Iran. Of course, the problem has been, from the point of view of the neocons who hatched this plan, and they wrote about it in something called the Project for the New American Century. The problem was that, one, the first country to be taken out, Iraq, was not taken out so easily. While it appeared easy at first because it was not hard to topple Hussein, the U.S., I think, did not count on, the intense resistance to it after that toppling. But the other big problem the U.S. faced was it was not able to overthrow Assad, despite all of its efforts, including funding and backing, terrorist groups in Syria, like Al Qaeda and ISIS. And in fact, as we know, Assad still remains, and he appears to be able to remain indefinitely. And that has slowed the U.S. down on its road to Tehran. But I believe that the U.S. still has its sights on remaking the Middle East, and that will depend on its ability to overthrow the Iranian government, which is one of the few holdouts in the region. And so the U.S. has now sanctioned Iran with these terrible sanctions, which these sanctions are destroying the Iranian economy, preventing important medicines from reaching the Iranian people. In fact, I read an interview with the head of the Jewish hospital in Tehran. And I want to point that out. There is a Jewish hospital in Tehran, which actually has received millions of dollars from the Iranian government. This is probably a fact that many people would be surprised by. And the head of that hospital has talked about the fact that Trump's new sanctions will kill children because they will not be able to get life-saving medicines, including chemotherapy medicines. And that is the goal. So the goal right now of the Trump administration is to try to economically strangle Iran, as the U.S. strangled Iran during Mossadegh's time to overthrow him, as they strangled the Chilean economy under Allende, right? Nixon talked about making Chile's economy scream. That's exactly what they're doing to Iran right now. They're trying to topple the government by undermining the economy and by also supporting these terrorist groups like the MEK group, which has killed over 17,000 Iranians over the weekend. So the same weekend that this terrorist attack happened in Iran, Rudy Giuliani was at a conference that was hosted by the MEK terrorists. Rudy Giuliani being the chief lawyer for Donald Trump, and he spoke openly at this conference in support of the MEK and in support of regime change. So we see that there is this concerted effort to overthrow the government of Iran, and we see various attacks happening, not just the attack over the weekend, but attacks by, for example, Israel on Iranian targets within Syria. We see, of course, the war in Yemen, which, while the Iranians are not that deeply involved in it, certainly Saudi Arabia and the U.S. And the UAE and Britain see the war in Yemen, I think wrongly, as a proxy war against Iran. In the end, what it is a genocidal war against the Yemeni people. And the latest figures are that 5 million children will die in a man-made famine in Yemen because of this conflict that the U.S. and Saudi Arabia in particular are waging against the Yemeni people. But all of this seems directed at Iran somehow. And one of the ironies, of course, if you can call it that, is that, once the U.S. overthrew Saddam Hussein, Saddam was a Sunni Muslim, and he and other Sunni Muslims ruled Iraq for decades with U.S. support over the Shiite majority of Iraq. So once the U.S. overthrew the Sunni government of Saddam Hussein, naturally the Shia majority took over Iraq. And naturally, they align themselves with Shia Iran. But then, of course, the U.S. expressed this surprise and upset, like, oh, now Iran has all this influence in the Middle East after we toppled Saddam Hussein. Well, of course, that was the case. So then the U.S. decided, oh, we really need to do something about Iran because our activities in Iraq just empowered Iran. So now we have to cut them back. And so I think we see much of what's been happening in the Middle East as a process of trying to isolate and undermine Iranian influence in the region.
In 2011, it seems a week Russia and China threw Libya to the dogs, giving Gaddafi up, so to speak, by not vetoing the UN 1973 resolution, which authorized the use of force in Libya. And it seems times have changed. It's a different world since then, with the last year Russia revealing its new hypersonic missiles and defense systems. And it seems they laid down the gauntlet with Syria, where Russia has given serious military support and the Chinese tacit support to Syria. It seems like there's this red line in the sand now with the Russians and the Chinese in Syria, and perhaps even more so with Iran. Do you see things escalating? I mean, is that a red line in the sand for Russia and China? Do you see that a potential escalation if Iran is overthrown, a serious regional or global conflict, or would it just be like a war? We go back to 1980, the first, what was it called? Really the first Gulf or Persian War between Iraq and Iran, where it was just between the two of them. Do you see something serious coming of this?
Yes, well, I mean, I do think that if the U.S. seriously intervened in Iran militarily, the risk of a third world war would be very, very high. You mentioned Libya, and you mentioned that China and Russia abstained from the resolution in the Security Council to create a no-fly zone over Libya. Of course, the no-fly zone quickly turned into regime change against Gaddafi and the murder of Gaddafi in October of 2011. What I understand happened was, one, that Putin was very upset. He saw the videotape of Gaddafi being sodomized and murdered, and he was very upset by it, and that he did decide after that it was a mistake to give NATO the carte blanche to do what they did, and that he would not allow the same thing to happen to Assad in Syria. And so that's when he decided Russia would be involved in Syria to support the government there against jihadists from taking over Syria. And of course, Russia has been very successful in doing that. And I do believe that Russia is very clear that it will not allow further destabilization of the Middle East. And China is also of that mind. And so I do think that if the U.S. would go into Iran, one of the most stable governments in that area, and try to, overthrow the government by force, it's very possible Russia would respond, and that the U.S. and Russia could be, in a military conflict, and possibly China too. John Pilger is one of my favorite journalists and writers, has talked about that even separate and apart from all this, the U.S. has its sights on China, and because it sees China as its biggest rival in the world, and that it may have sights on militarily attacking China, even separate and apart from all these conflicts in the Middle East. So I think, we're in a very dangerous situation that people need to be aware of, and they need to resist. I mean, we need to fight this idea of war that our country seems so wedded to, and we need to stop the next war before it happens.
Right, Pilger produced that great documentary, I believe, The Coming War on China. Some of my final questions. Do you see Russia, China, and Iran coming together as a more tightly knit unit or axis and morphing into what one might call Halford Mackinder's worst nightmare, a new Silk Road type of Eurasian superpower?
I do see that, and I welcome it. To be honest, I'll be totally truthful. I have given up on the West. I think the West is bankrupt. And why? Because it is so wedded to unrestrained capitalism, you know. And I think that to have Russia, China, Iran, India, perhaps South Africa, Brazil, I hope, maybe, being a counterweight to the United States is very critical. I see the U.S. as the biggest threat to world peace. And it's not just me. There have been a couple polls worldwide which show that people throughout the world, in huge numbers, see the U.S. as the biggest threat to peace in the world. And I think that's obvious. And I think there needs to be a counterbalance like there was during the Cold War. I think a lot of us, didn't realize what we had with the existence of the Soviet Union, as a check on the U.S. power. But we need that type of check again. And frankly, in order for humanity to survive.
Any final thoughts on Iran, regime change, U.S. empire, any other point do you think we may have overlooked?
My main point would be this: Iran is a beautiful, ancient country. The people there are very intellectual, very modern, very progressive in thought, And a lot of people in Iran do not like the current theocratic government, as many of us on the left are not crazy about. But in the end, it's up to the Iranian people alone to decide what kind of government they're going to have. And I think for the West to continue to cling to the hubris that it can choose what type of government other countries will have is not just folly, but it's absolutely wrong, and it's absolutely bad for the people that they claim to save. I think in the end, Iran will find its way. The people of Iran will progress and they'll develop in the way they want if left to their own devices. And we need to fight our own countries like the US and Britain and Canada for the Iranian people's right to determine their own fate. And that is a very important right that it's enshrined in the UN Charter, that all peoples have the right to choose their own government, have the right to be sovereign, to control their own resources, and the U.S. has to be brought to heel to allow that to happen.
And could you tell us about your new book, which I think it's your third book coming out in November, called The Plot to Control the World?
Yeah, so thanks for asking about that. That is going to be a book focused on U.S. interference throughout the world, especially since World War II, in the elections and democratic processes of other countries, in light of these claims against Russia allegedly interfering in the U.S. elections. And what I try to show in my book is that whatever is even alleged against Russia pales in comparison to what the U.S. has done in not only meddling in or interfering in other countries' elections, but in actually destroying the democratic processes and the democratic governments of many foreign countries. And that is another history that Americans need to really come to grips with.
And how can people best follow you and your work?
Well, you can buy my books. You can get it through Amazon, Barnes and Noble, many independent bookstores, and I often write for Counterpunch as well. So look for me there.
And you're also on Twitter, yes.
And I'm on Twitter and Facebook. Yes, indeed.
Until they terminate your account.
Right, exactly. So follow me while you can.
I know I will definitely pre-order your book on Amazon, the Kindle version, because it's hard to get books out here in Kazakhstan physically.
I believe it.
And everyone should go out and purchase your previous books and pre-order the new one. Thanks for the work you do and the books that you continue to publish.
Thank you. I really enjoyed the interview.